Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast, and today it's just the Pugs. We're glad to be together, we're glad to be with you. And let me introduce myself, then we'll go around the horn, as they say in baseball, and let the other guys do that as well. I'm C.R. Wiley, I'm a pastor, and I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I actually live about half a mile from Portland, or not half a mile, half an hour. I don't want to be that close. But anyway, Portland, Oregon. And I've written a number of things, and I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, philosophy, ethics, religious studies, a host of other things. And one of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
Great. Okay, Glenn, why don't you introduce yourself and then take us into the subject of the day, because it's your day.
Yeah, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I also work with Reflections Ministries, and I have my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries, esquareinch.org. I'm a retired history professor at Central Connecticut State University, specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe, and that has at least a little bit tangentially to do with what we're going to talk about today. There was an article by Michael De Sapio at the American Conservative.
Actually, it's Imaginative Conservative.
Excuse me. Yes, I can read. Imaginative Conservative, called On the Artistic and Intellectual Temperaments. And what he's doing in this article is he's talking about temperament, yes, but more broadly about the nature of people who are given to artistic work, people who are given to intellectual work, by which he sees these days being primarily academics. And what are the connections between the two, or these days mostly what are the connections that don't exist between the two? There are a lot of people who historically, if you take a look at this, coming at this, he doesn't get into this, but coming at this from my perspective as a Renaissance historian, when you look at the artists in the Renaissance, they were very much aware of and interacting with the intellectual trends of their day. And the reason for that was quite simple. The people who were paying them, their patrons, were also heavily involved in the intellectual trends of the day. They were very well educated. They knew what was going on. They were engaged and sponsoring scholars, just like they were sponsoring artists, and so on. And what this did is it shaped the tastes of the artistic patrons. The subjects that they wanted painted, how they wanted them done, the kinds of sculptures that they were looking for, all of these kinds of things. Without going into all of the dimensions of Renaissance art here, because you also have to take into account what's going on in Northern Europe at the time. There are a whole bunch of things happening there that really shaped the Italian Renaissance and that aren't often credited. For example, you get realistic art in the North well before you get it in Italy. Oil painting is developed in the North, and the skills and techniques are transferred south, and so on. But the fact is that for the topic today, without me getting too squirreled here, the topic today of the connection between the intellectual and the artistic, when you're looking at the Renaissance, the two of them are very closely connected. You can't really understand Renaissance art without understanding Renaissance humanism, the cult of antiquity, all of these other things that shaped the broader intellectual climate of the Renaissance. Today, and he actually cites Jacques Barzun going back to the early 20th century, that's no longer really the case. There's been this sort of bifurcation in a lot of ways between the intellectual world and the artistic world. He uses the illustration of peanuts. Schroeder is your artist. Linus is your scholar, intellectual, depressive type. He uses that as sort of showing these two poles. In the popular imagination, sometimes they're still connected. But by and large, he argues that they're really going in different directions. So let me pause here and get some reactions at this point.
Did he give a kind of date to identify as the point at which they move apart? Because when I think about like 19th and early 20th century artists, people like, I don't know, Salvador Dali or Picasso or those they seem to have some exposure to at least what was going on in philosophy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's true. But he cites Jacques Barzun again. Instances where art became deeply anti-intellectual. He cites politicized art of the absurd, narcissistic or nihilistic gestures posing as art. All of these, he says, manifest the departure of genuine intellect from the art world.
Well,
so I think you're right. I think he's kind of overlooking the idea that there is still a connection between intellectual life and the art in the early 20th century, but I think it's fairly superficial. It's moving into these areas of recognizing that materialism leads you to a meaningless universe, and so you get meaningless art. Things like that.
There seems to be maybe another way of thinking about it, and I don't want to make this too definitional, but the way in which academic trends themselves have been severed in many ways from intellectual life in a proper sense of the word. And so having a tie to those kind of trends and fashions definitely still came through a certain kind of, at least kind of, a series of cultural participations in which artists somehow were drawing on maybe sometimes the more radical or fringe ideas that were going on in certain academic circles, and then in kind of exploring what that looked like when they applied it to their craft. And I think Chris was hitting on some of that. I mean, take Freud's work and then all of a sudden the way that gets kind of imported into the way of looking at reality and trying to draw out those things in art. But that speaks of something, I think, pretty profound, in that intellectual life becomes almost something that most people associate with academic world, but it isn't necessarily the case. And I think we're seeing a kind of return to that ourselves today, when ideologies and politicization of certain kinds of, ideas and even whole fields of study have been hijacked. And the classic ways, at least, of intellectual life have been pretty much buried or largely disappear.
Yeah. Let me give you, I'm inclined to agree with you. And Francis Schaeffer talked about this a lot. He talked about how intellectual life shapes artistic life, and he goes down to the line of despair, where it goes from the intellectuals through the artists and so on down to popular culture. I think you're right about that. And I think De Sapio here misses some of the intellectual currents that are at work in art. But let me give you an example. I was in New York a few years ago with Lynn, and we went to the Gugenheim. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to the Gugenheim, but it's actually a spiral. It just sort of goes up in a ring spiral up to the top, and they've got exhibit galleries off to the sides and things like that. But the core of the museum is this long thing going around. My mom, who grew up in New York and actually had been to the Gugenheim, always said that when she was a kid, she always wanted to roller skate down it. So Lynn and I went to the Gugenheim, and we went up to the top floor, the top of it, and started working our way down. And most of what was in there, to my eyes, seemed kind of meaningless and pretentious and so on. I remember one thing that was supposed to be a depiction of moonlight, and you go into this sort of separate room, and there's nothing in the room except a single power cord coming down with a light bulb lit up there, and that's art. That's moonlight.
Right.
Okay. Now, if you push me, I can come up with some sort of meaning to that. But frankly, a lot of it looked like real nonsense. And after we'd gone just a little way down it, Lynn asked me, what I thought, and my response was, I'm kind of ready for a pair of roller skates.
Right. Yeah, I've been to the Gugenheim, and my experience was the same as yours, Glenn. It's not even a well-made building.
No.
If you have any background in sort of building trades, you can see a lot of things that are wrong with it, and just even from even the aesthetic, which is trying to say something, it's kind of shoddy. But I guess the thing that we're kind of getting at is there actually is a connection, but it reflects badly on the state of the intellectual life in our time. Most intellectuals, as you guys know, are captive to leftist ideologies and can't really think outside of those. And what goes along with that is a dismissal of our patrimony in the West, in spite of all of its riches and beauty. And there's just this weird incongruous dynamic. So like when you go to a place like New York or Boston and certainly Europe, the most attractive parts of town are the older parts of town, and that's where all the intellectuals and the artists want to be. But at the same time, when it's their turn to design a building or make a piece of furniture or a painting, they create something that no one would want to be around, including them.
So I've got a lot of examples from Paris.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we're in a bad place. I guess sympathetically with the writer, I would say he's right in the sense that genuine intellectual life and the current state of the arts are not in harmony at all. They're at odds with each other. But in terms of the contemporary intellectual world, it's pretty much there.
Yeah, we have to be careful here. He draws a distinction, and I think this is a really important one. And the connections are, I think the piece is worth reading, which is why I pulled it out. But he thinks intellectual life is, has got a lot of validity. He says right now you see it primarily in academia. That's where the focus is. But he draws a distinction between the intellectual temperament or that sort of thing, people who are given to an intellectual life, and intellectuals. He says using the word intellectual as a noun rather than an adjective. There's in his mind, and I think he's right about this, there's a big difference between the two. Barzan, again, points out that the word intellectual as a noun only appears in something like the 19th century, late 19th century. And it was a way people used to describe themselves as being part of what I suppose we would today call a knowledge economy or something along those lines. Barzan himself found the term pretentious. I always did as well. And in fact, when I was in college, I remember thinking, I am not an intellectual. I might be a scholar, but I am not an intellectual.
Okay.
I always, because my instinctive reaction to the term was always that it was kind of pretentious. It was always about these sort of avant-garde, cutting-edge ideas and things like that were not really where I was at. They weren't the kinds of questions I was interested in. They weren't the stuff I wanted to pursue.
Yeah, wasn't it Paul Johnson who wrote the book Intellectuals?
I think so.
Yeah, where he kind of does an expose on just sort of the
the lives
awful
they live.
moral.
Yeah,
That's right.
the lives they live, that kind of parallel. Yeah, and very different than the way that the emphasis on the intellect in classic knowing. It wasn't about that, even though it talked about higher things and the contemplative we'll be getting into at some point later. These things were not. They were looked at actually with lives of humility and discipline. They were not. I mean, there was always the temptation. Even St. Paul will tell you, knowledge puffeth up, right? When it's looked, when you pursue it in a way that kind of makes you kind of the go-to, rather than that it's a gift that you get to participate in and share. I mean, there's the different things that go with it. So there's always that kind of goal there, but you often see rigorous disciplines that you're committed to because of the pursuit of these kinds of things of great worth. And here, the thing of great worth, it sort of becomes you, right? You and what you know, and that comes to stage. I mean, to be fair, there are some people I know who you would quote unquote in those terms call intellectuals, who really just just really their whole head is in kind of the sphere of learning and knowing, and they really can't take a step out of it in any way whatsoever. And maybe that just characterizes everything they're driven for. But you're right, like Paul Johnson's book, the people that we've kind of made in the modern world as the saints, if you will, of intellectual life, were anything but saintly.
Right. So, I like that distinction you made earlier, Glenn, between scholar and intellectual. Can you elaborate a bit?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, my sort of instinctive sense of the term intellectual was someone who was, like I said, working in kind of trendy things, sort of working on cutting edge ideas, and was, cutting edge in the sense, for me, it was mostly sort of social theory, political theory, sociology, anthropology, these sort of soft sciences.
Right.
And like I said, there was always a sense of a little bit of pretension to that.
Yeah.
I had a couple of people in mind when I was in college. I was thinking, all right, they're intellectuals. I'm really not.
Sure.
I'm a scholar. I'm interested in rolling up my sleeves and doing the work and digging in and getting solid information and doing solid analysis of it, maybe doing some synthetic work as well, those kinds of things. I'm not interested in the trendy stuff.
Well, that's a good distinction. I guess that's what I sensed you were saying. A scholar is more workmanlike. It's more of a kind of a craft, you could even say. I know the texts. I know where to go. I know how to interpret them. I know how to represent what they say to other people, help them understand. So
well, and even when I was in undergrad, I was a linguistics major, and what I did as a linguistics major, what we did was we analyzed languages,
right,
and I was really good at that. I mean, I could break down languages, I could figure out what was going on, I could present conclusions, all of those kinds of things. But it was always anchored in doing the work and looking at the stuff and drawing out of it what's there. And as a historian, I do essentially the same kind of thing.
Well, yeah, maybe to kind of further elaborate on the distinction between, say, an intellectual and a scholar, maybe the intellectual, like you noted, is pretentious and trendy, but maybe the emphasis is on creativity or originality. Whereas when I think scholarship, I think that the emphasis is on the body of knowledge,
rootedness.
Rooted,
and
right.
I think that's again definitely a byproduct of a lot of the Enlightenment and modernity. This emphasis on Peter Gay's work on the heresy of modernity. The lure of it is make it new, right? This kind of sense of everything to be new, and he goes through this list of all the differing figures, everything from Oscar Wilde on down to the emphasis on this originality and newness.
And that's a characteristic of the avant-garde, which arose in the early 20th century. I would also argue it's connected to Romanticism.
Yes.
That this idea of creativity, of personal expression, all of those kinds of things, which likely we got to point to Rousseau.
Yeah. Right.
But what does it say about kind of, the lay of the land to where that kind of leisurely pursuit can be taken seriously in some cultural domains. I mean, think of different times in history. It would have been a very small arena in which that any kind of creativity or expressiveness would have even been considered of anything of worth, largely because, culture in the world wasn't set up for it. It was about basically survival on one end or contemplating ultimate things on the other. So you're having a space created in the modern world in which this kind of thing can be pursued and in some places, do some dazzling work.
Well, let's go back to the Renaissance. One of the things that starts happening in the Renaissance is you begin getting artists signing their work. Yeah. Prior to that, art was considered a craft. Shoemakers don't put their names on their shoes. Mm-hmm. Okay. Carpenters don't carve their names on the beams. Okay.
I do have an example of an exception, but go ahead.
Well,
I'll save my exception for later.
And Adidas puts their marks on their shoes and things like that today. Okay, but that's mass production stuff. But generally speaking, you don't see that happening. And art was the same way, which is why in the Middle Ages you don't see that happening. In the Renaissance, people start signing their art. Now, this is treated as the discovery of the individual, the personal expression, personal creativity, all those kinds of things. That's utter nonsense. Remember, these guys are working on commission to produce things that they're asked to produce. I want a painting of this. Yeah. Okay. So why are they signing them? The same reason why advertisers advertise. They want people to recognize that the work is theirs so that they get more commissions. In the world of the Italian Renaissance, that becomes really, really important. And there is an element, it's not all that. There is an element of personal fame and things like that connected to it. But it's really not so much about our kind of idea of I want to be creative and original in my own artistic vision and those kinds of things. It isn't. They're working on commission. They are making things that people ask them to make. They tell them the subject matter and they produce it.
Yeah, there are some other dimensions to it I'd like to explore, but I get your point and I agree with it. But at the same time, we have an interest in those artists. And sometimes we're a little unhappy to discover that we can't know who they were. For example, when we think about someone like Leonardo, who was really a crossover kind of person. I mean, he was on the one hand an inventor, on the other hand a fine artist. And he's just kind of freakish in that respect.
Well, be careful. A lot of the Renaissance artists did a lot more than we normally remember them for. Michelangelo was designing fortifications.
Right. But I guess the thing is, when I think about, sort of the ideal, I kind of think about that. Now, getting a little further down the road into the Romantic period, I think about there are some people that I would classify as influenced by Romanticism that I actually like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, or you think about somebody like the people behind the arts and crafts movement who were trying to figure out a way to take the best of the industrial processes and sort of preserve craftsmanship at the same time. So there were people that stand out for that reason. But even when we think of somebody like, say, Chesterton, Chesterton. So, when I think of an artistic temperament, I was wondering if we were going to go into this. We do have a kind of, quirkiness, kind of a delightful quirkiness in some cases, and maybe a appalling quirkiness in other cases. Does the author get into that at all? I like to explore that, because some of my favorite artists are just quirky people.
Yeah, it mentions that a little bit, but some of the commentary on that has to do less with the fact that the artistic person's obviously the artistic temperament is going to be creative and all that kind of thing, which can lend itself to that. But again, in terms of where we are today, in popular culture, the idea of someone being an intellectual is really not a positive thing. For a lot of people out there, that's something they sort of look down their nose at. Now think about the word artiste. You got exactly the same kind of reaction to it. So they talk about it a little bit in those, a little bit in those terms, but they don't get into that element of, well, as you say, quirkiness and such. He didn't get into that very much, but I think you're right. That's definitely there.
It's interesting that one of your favorite people, Glenn, Rousseau, one of the things you kind of recall about his Confessions is, on the one hand, kind of mimicking Augustine, but on the other, it's marked all over the place by specific dates, places, and times. Very different than kind of the way Augustine wrote, right? Mm-hmm. Where you don't know exactly the dates or the times. It's very similar to Lewis recasting his story about when he's converted, right? Lewis is very attuned almost to the way Augustine approaches time and space in his talking about himself in his relationship to fuller reality, whereas Rousseau has it very locked in on all the kind of one-dimensional things wrapped around him. And that becomes all throughout it this emphasis that, on the one hand, I'm not responsible for my actions because this is the way, quote unquote, God happened to make me, if you will, or like it or not. But there's one thing that will happen in all of this is I will never be a repeatable episode of humanity. Here's your kind of nominalism run crazy. It is,
and we can be grateful.
Yes, that's right. That's it. And this really starts to thread itself out. And I think Chris tunes in that there are different dimensions to Romanticism. On the one hand, I think Romanticism, clean out some of its hypertrophied modernism, if you will. You can find certain dimensions, like in Vico, that are very Christian in the development of the notion of imagination and what it means to be a distinct creature made in the image of God in our own contribution. I think those are goods, like mm-hmm. Coleridge similarly. Or it could end up running into this kind of Rousseauian, almost the whole emphasis is just on developing, like Oscar Wilde tried to do, his personality, right? And the art is really their personality writ onto whatever they do or make or anything else, or their perspective or their slant or their take. It really becomes a lot about them as much as it is about what they're trying to do to or for you or society or anything else.
Yeah, it's celebrity, and that actually is that's another dimension he doesn't get into, but there are a couple of things that are connected to this. One of them is the division that occurs in the 19th century between popular culture and elite culture. What most people don't really understand is that Mozart operas were written as much for the common people as for the nobility.
Right.
All through that era, there was really no distinction between popular and elite culture. Or vanishingly small, largely because of budget. That would be the main difference in a lot of ways. Yeah. The sense of humor was the same. All kinds of things were the same. Maybe a higher degree of sophistication among the educated, but basically the same kind of stuff. The division between elite and popular culture begins in the 19th century. And with Romanticism, you begin getting, in some romantic circles, not all of them, in some romantic circles, you begin getting the idea of the artist as hero.
Yeah.
Right.
And that degenerates. In one sense, the artist as hero is the idea that the artist is the person who sees the world clearly and is telling you about it, is revealing it to you, all of these kinds of things through their personal genius. That's one dimension to it. But what it degenerates to is celebrity culture.
Yeah, I guess the thing that to kind of ponder is whether one kind of gives birth to the other. So let me give an example of the act of signing something that we wouldn't normally associate with, say, a painting or something like that. So my son Gabe and his wife, they bought a house that was built in 1928 in Connecticut, old but not old by New England standards, and really a fine house. I always admired it because I drove by it for years, and then when it came on the market, I was actually the real estate agent that represented my son and his wife to buy the house. So I had the opportunity to negotiate the deal and make the deal happen. But when I got into the house and looked at the sort of the quality of the work, I was really impressed. I mean, this is a house that's almost 100 years old. The original double hung windows are there, and they don't bind at all. There's been zero settling of the house. Everything is just really solid. None of the doors bind. Everything is just in marvelous shape, square, plumb, everything. Anyway, my son, Gabe, when he was getting the the boiler serviced, and the oil company came by to take a look at it. The oil company is like a family concern that's been in the area for generations, and the young man who was talking to my son said, "I think my grandfather built this house." And Gabe said, "Wow, that's great." And then when Gabe was working on it, he was renovating the bathroom. He took off the door jamb, and the guy had signed the house. It was Gaudier, so it was the same name. So it really was the grandfather of this guy that built the house. But let me tell you, the house is a work of art from the standpoint of a house builder. Mm-hmm. And we're going to keep that house in the family, going forward, because it's just such a great house. But I guess the question that I have is was that an ego trip, or was that a legitimate sort of pride, or is that saying my reputation is on the line with this house?
Oh no, it was hidden.
Yeah, well, that's true.
It was hidden. It was
right.
That was pride in workmanship, I would say.
Yeah. That's a very good point. It was on a stud, king stud for a door. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it reminds me of cathedral builders. When people were doing work, repair work, checking out how things were, they went upstairs in some of these cathedrals, and they found sculptures upstairs that weren't just sort of stored in the attic. They were part of the building that no one could see but God himself.
Right.
And they were part of what the cathedral builders very self-consciously did.
Right.
And that it's not the same thing, but it's along those lines. It's something that's hidden. It's not there to show off or for public consumption or anything like that. It's just a personal, as I said, pride and craftsmanship in this case, I would think.
That's interesting, because you sort of see even in certain Christian literature and texts. I mean, I know there were a lot of kind of false texts created as though they were written by authoritative authors for a host of different, reasons. But then you have a figure that is fascinating, like and is as influential, and that is like what we call today kind of Dionysius the Areopagite. Right. Who the story was then that this is sort of the one who was the Areopagite, and of course mentioned by Paul, but of course we know by kind of what's going on there later that it's not. But this kind of move away from putting oneself out there. I mean, on one end you could say they were trying to claim, but this was a rumored claim that they were the Areopagite. But on the other hand, it has become, because of that fact and that association, one of the most influential writings that theologians had to take seriously. But it is also a very profound writing that has vast Christian insight into dimensions of reality that a lot of theologians never had. And it is a strange work, but you kind of could see it almost as another kind of very creative work that the author remains somewhat hidden and anonymous.
Yeah, well, that one itself, the idea of pseudonyms, that's an interesting. There are the early church had ethical qualms about pseudonymous writings. They said basically it's a species of lying. But over time, for whatever reason, there seems to be less. Well, in this case, whether or not the guy just signed his name Dionysius and then the Areopagite was added later, we don't really know. But yeah, it's you're right. The goal isn't to draw attention to yourself. The goal is to draw attention to the ideas.
Yeah.
Whatever is the motivation, whatever is the purpose behind these things, it's about drawing attention to the ideas.
Yeah.
You know, not the person. So there's a very different motivation there.
One of the things that Plato, for example, noted is there is a kind of charis or grace that artists and some kind of more or less being touched by the divine in such a way that you do become a little weird.
Yeah, yeah, man.
So for example, when we think about scriptures and we think about Saul, is Saul, the Spirit of God falls on him and he prophesies, but apparently if you were a prophet, you were a little odd. And people said, is Saul counted among the prophets now? Because he's behaving in an odd way.
Yeah.
Particularly when you look at the second instance where that phrase comes up, where he's lying naked before Samuel.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there is something a little odd about being kind of taken up in the spirit of something. And I think when we associate that with, artists, more so artists than, say, intellectuals.
It's interesting, though, that I think for Plato and a lot of the Greek world, the poet played a kind of profitory, kind of sometimes divine madness function or revelatory function, even to the point where there's kind of debates in Christian ways of putting it, whether the kind of rationalist contemplative versus the poetic imaginative is the best way of unpacking the richness of revelatory insight. But it's interesting that does the connection, because you're dealing with Renaissance, of course, with a kind of antenna for kind of trying to retrieve things under certain conditions of the past, was that emphasis on poet, and the kind of resourcing the world with the poet as genius, hero, and the like, something that would have kind of played in from Renaissance into Romanticism.
Well, it's interesting. I would argue that poets are really important in the Middle Ages too.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
you certainly get it through the Renaissance. You certainly get it through the Romantic period, and really into the 20th century. Remember, Lewis wanted to be remembered as a poet.
Yeah.
I don't really know that we have since the early 20th century. I don't think poetry any longer plays as significant a role as it used to.
Yeah, yeah.
I saw a sketch by Steve Allen once, in which he was talking about poetry and how people were saying poetry was dead, but actually, real poetry today is found in the lyrics of songs. That's where you find poetry. And he was going to do a poetry reading of one of these to demonstrate this. And what he did is he recited Donna Summer's "Hot Stuff Baby Tonight." But people will point to rap maybe or things like that, but it's not the same. It's not doing what poetry used to do.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Glenn. My wife's family, my wife's from Colombia, and her family, a lot of them come from rich traditions. And when they get together as family, big families, One of the customs is eventually, as things, they converse, they feast, they spend hours together. They don't just spend a quick hour and then they're off to their own thing. And one of the things they do is begin citing the poetry that is meaningful to their family, their life, their culture, their place. Even my wife's father, he can quote page after page of page and recite the whole poems. And these things are not just kind of, reiterations of things they personally like, but connect them all very much together, culture and deeper things. And so that was very characteristic. I mean, you hear it, kind of ancient culture, storytelling is very tied up in this as well.
Yeah, well, in Russia, the Soviet Union, poetry readings, a poet reading his own writing, they would fill sports stadia.
Wow.
They'd have entire stadiums full of people to listen to poets read their work. I mean, it's our culture that's really lost that. There are a lot of other cultures around the world that still value poetry.
Value it, yeah.
Seems to me that there needs to be a kind of a metaphysical underpinning, for poetry to have that kind of appeal.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just talking about your emotional state, and maybe the only people who care what you think or feel are the people who share your, quote, identity or whatever, as opposed to poets that are talking about reality as such.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like, I don't know, you remember Federico Lorca, right? The Spanish poet. One of the things that went into his own study was he would go into the Andalusian regions and look at the way in which Byzantine and Morocco, all these hosts of cultures came together, and their liturgical traditions rhythmically played in to the way in which those liturgies actually shaped culture, and they became what he drove his own poetry creations from. So there is this, he called them actually deep song, right? Mm-hmm. That was the name of the poems themselves. And they're very simple line, very rhythmic, but very colorful. And they really bring you into a real profound appreciation of beauty, which is something incredible to know that language and sound and timing have so much power.
Yeah. I personally think that one of the things we, as Christians, desperately need to rediscover is poetry. This ties in with, and the reason has to do with my thing about imagination. That imagination is a critical area for apologetics these days. Because what poetry does, among other things, or for that matter, let's go to the idea of a sacramental worldview. What poetry does is it makes you look beyond the surface. It's using words that if you just pay attention to the surface of it, you're not going to get what's really going on. It sort of demands that you probe beyond just the superficial surface meanings and consider on a deeper level what a good poem is doing. And it becomes a way, I think, of training our mind to see the world in bigger terms than just sort of the bare literal thing that's been left to us by scientism.
Yeah.
I wonder, too, if there isn't a cost that we see being kind of exacted from regular people because of the contempt of elites for popular poetry. Like when you think about, say, the visual arts, the artists that appeal almost immediately to just about everybody who isn't a part of that bohemian intellectual world are artists like, Norman Rockwell. And he was technically a very, capable artist, and he was certainly able to do what he set out to do and do it really well. But many people in the sort of higher, sort of sophisticated, sort of like levels of the art world look down on him, but also on anybody who like him. And it seems to me that if we really want people to go further in and higher up, then there's got to be a place to begin that's legitimate. And I think, somebody like Howard Pyle or Norman Rockwell is a good place to start. You say, okay, yeah, I mean, there are more sophisticated things going on, more sophisticated, sort of works of art, but there's nothing contemptible about what he's doing. He's appealing to human sentiments that are very broad and shared by people from all kinds of backgrounds, but in order to move further along, you don't have to like insult people who like that stuff. But that's often what these status conscious, intellectuals do is, make people feel ashamed of the, and so then, because of the poetry, like let's say Kipling or whatever, because they say, oh, that was just, and then they give you all the reasons why you shouldn't like that. Then people almost say, well, if that's the way this all works, then I'm just not going to go any further into it. I'm just going to go and do other things. Why should I read poetry? Why should I have any interest in art if everything I like you think is just evidence of my, being unsophisticated and unworthy?
I'll I'll never forget that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was in prison, but he was engaged to a young girl, and I remember in one of his prayers he was concerned because she liked reading Rilke. but yeah, I mean I mean, back to one of the things you started out with, this way of entering in, and Glenn, another point you had made connected to that is that Christians appreciating it, and it is difficult to get people directed that way and appreciating it that way. Again, maybe it's contexts for it and things like that. But I mean, I think the capacity, like Chris, where you're going with it, is the capacity to find rich examples of it that become a starting point or an entryway that can be appreciated, and you don't have to have all your guards up, but also help to be ways of training us to appreciate. I mean, like Lewis could read Wordsworth, who didn't share much of his worldview, and captured elements of it that were very Christian and were very capturing something of the joy of existence without someone who probably transcending the person who wrote it. And so appreciating a wide variety of this gift that creation has without having to see even some of those, the Rilkes of the world as something that, we always have to be concerned if someone's reading.
Yeah. The interesting thing at this point is what you're describing here on some level is what the article is talking about, where there has been a growing, in a sense, a bifurcation between what the academics are doing. Most academia today reminds me in many ways of the way I imagine things were during the Terror in the French Revolution. Not that they're necessarily beheading people, although probably not for lack of desire, but because everything has become, in a lot of ways, not in every department, but things have become very political and very kind of rigid and dogmatic, and you can only see things through the certain set of lenses. And anything that departs from that is counter-revolutionary, basically.
Yeah.
There's a strong stream in academia that goes in that kind of a direction, and it's humorless and it's artless in the really negative sense of the word.
And thoughtless. I mean, it just becomes trying to join the drum patterns of the person's irritation who's in the front of the classroom. I mean, it really becomes what it does. I mean, the students just basically become echoes of what the professor is mad at or angry about or doesn't like, and students aren't learning. I notice even in, I've noticed a certain softening of some of the, I mean, couple terms back, it was pretty thick. The whole hyper woke, pressure. I've noticed that a lot of where, circles I'm in that have been influenced by it, places I've teach, have taken quite a few steps back, and that stuff is kind of not so upfront in the pressure. And I think it also has backfired on some of the administration, because the ones that were promoting it the most, it came back to haunt most because people brought issues up against those people.
Yeah, brought charges.
That's right. That's right. And so what ends up happening then, but you do still, when I raise questions from the material we're reading, I mean, we're reading Plato, we're reading Aristotle, we're reading all these figures, and students are afraid to say anything at all. You ask a question, I mean, even just like a broad one, how do you know you exist? Pure silence. I mean, and maybe that's a heavy one. maybe that's
maybe they just don't know what to say. But it's like, what's your favorite color? And people are afraid to talk.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Well, I've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail. That's a dangerous question.
I think. There's been a kind of it's something I refer to as the pumpkin ale phenomenon. And what I mean by that is that, I don't know if you recall, but maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we had peak pumpkin ale. So you would go, like in October, you would go to the get some beer, and there was just nothing but pumpkin ale. Every single brewer had their own take on pumpkin ale, and people were just sick of it. They just got that's it. I don't want to ever see pumpkin ale ever again.
I sort of feel that way about IPAs, actually.
And then then it was like next year you couldn't even find a pumpkin ale. I mean, it was like, I think what happened is they lost so much money on this pumpkin ale fad that people said, okay, we're never going there again. And I think that's what's become of kind of the woke phenomenon. So even big box chains like Lowe's are like taking it all back, firing their DEI departments, all that kind of stuff. So I think we have returned to a measure of sanity. We're not entirely sane, but I think
that's right.
I think things are trending in a good direction. But so there are fads that come, fads that go. Bell bottoms were a thing. Not bathing was a thing.
Yeah.
But think about this for a minute. Think about this sort of woke environment. What kind of art comes out of that?
Bad,
if any.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of bifurcation that we're talking about here.
Well, and this is where you get it. This is where you were saying basically a little while ago. This is kind of symbolism without sacrament. In other words, or think of it a different way: a symbolic representation of something woke likes, its ideals, but it's contentless. I mean, we could name figures in politics right now where that is all over the place, where they check the box of this person who has been underrepresented and this person, this gender that has been and yet there has been no expectation that has had any of these symbols to form and develop in such a way that they have substantive things to say for anybody or anyone other than the fact that they tick the box. And you can't have so many of these in key places of influence and leadership without any substance or very little substance other than just the same hot air of, I represent all the kind of letters and figures that were left out, 200 years ago, and I represent empowerment. What do you do with it?
The exception, I'll have to back off a little bit here. Look at the opening ceremony of the Olympics, which I think we brought up before.
Yeah.
Okay, that is an attempt at art, bad art, but it's an attempt at art. They're doing all the representation things. But the thing that separates them from standard wokeness, perhaps, is that they're coming at it from a distinctly pagan direction. And I'm using the word pagan here in a technical sense.
Yeah.
So when you take wokeness and marry it to something like paganism as an attack on Christianity as oppressive and all of that sort of thing, you might be able to pull in elements out of some of these other traditions that you can, like the pagan tradition, that you can use. You can use it to subvert Christian imagery, those kinds of things. But that's about as far as you go. And frankly,
Yeah.
like I said, it isn't even really good art.
Yeah, you're either queering norms, right? I mean, that's what they think is profound and somehow brilliant, or kind of what we talked about last week, destroying things. Or I mean, you have no beauty vision that is being articulated in any kind of. I mean, there's no smidgen of an apprehension of the beautiful and the good or the true, other than just this is another same sign of the rainbow. You know, that I mean, it's just the same thing over and over and over again, and it's boring, it's banal, it's, you know, it doesn't lead anywhere. At least with, you know, let's talk about kind of marginalized communities that were legitimately oppressed in certain kinds of third world countries. They had a lot of creative art and element because they had to suffer a lot. And that usually sets the conditions for ways in which one apprehends meaning and beauty and being, because you have to have an antenna for that because everything else is taken away from you. That is not this spoiled bunch.
Well, I think when you get to that, you know, when we think about great music, for example, particularly great folk music, I think people can recognize it when they see it or hear it. And there is an audience that develops just spontaneously across cultural lines. The problem is when you try to fabricate something for mass consumption, and it's not genuinely rooted in any kind of tradition. So, you know, when I think about the American musical experience, particularly American folk music, the best stuff comes out of the South. Comes from a range of ethnic backgrounds and communities. And there's an interesting kind of cross-fertilization that occurs with it. You know, so like when I listen to African music, I can say, yeah, I can see a connection, I suppose. I can hear a connection to American Black musical traditions, but there's something very different about the American Black music.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it? Well, it's because it's been in touch with Irish music, Scottish music, you know, French, you know, Creole. There's all this other stuff that it's in communication with, that has enriched it, and I think makes it better. I think American Black folk musical traditions are superior. I'm sorry if there are some African folks out there who disagree with me, but I think just on the standpoint of the wide appeal of American Black musical traditions. Think about, like, say, for example, the difference between bluegrass and country and, say, you know, Irish and Scottish folk ballads. The American stuff is better. And it's because of its interaction with the Black stuff and other traditions in America. It's so much richer. And I know that there are people out there who are probably shouting at the radio or listening, you know, or saying no way. But I just
the Irish throwing their Guinness at you at this point.
but here's the thing. I remember I had a professor who studied in Ireland, and he said, when I got there and I turned on the radio, it was nothing but Nashville.
Well, actually, I just heard an Irish group that it sounded like they were singing bluegrass, but it was a traditional Irish ballad. You know, the sound of the voice, everything sounded like it was coming from
the rudiments. The rudiments are there, and they contribute to each other. I mean, without them, there wouldn't even be bluegrass. But likewise, it's kind of it's touching up against. I mean, that's one of, I think, the beautiful things about the American experience is the way in which these things. I mean, also think about the way salsa develops out of the kind of Cuban and the African beats coming together with Latin rhythms and melodies and kind of some jazz elements. I mean, it is phenomenal. It becomes something you almost associate with classic Latin culture, but it's something that really was birthed in a lot of the Puerto Rican neighborhoods and the like in New York.
Right.
In Sierra Leone, reggae is really popular.
There you go. You got the islands. You know, you got West Indian blacks and their music kind of filtering back into Africa.
Yeah.
So,
But all of them have very rich folk traditions that still draw off of those sources, those original
Right,
cultural
sure.
sources, and they
Sure.
really they participate in the continuance of these traditions. I mean, I often think of that, theology and Christianity is one of the Christian intellectual traditions. You're drawing off of these rich sources and you're feeding off of them. They're forming you, but you have something at your place in time in which all of that is coming together and communicating itself in a variety of ways. And we can be enriched by it, or we can stifle it, right?
Yeah. Well, we're getting to the point where we should wrap things up. So this has been your show, Glenn. Is there anything you want to say as we do this?
yeah, just one comment that I mentioned that the author distinguishes between an intellectual temperament or intellectual pursuits and being an intellectual. I think that the distinction that he makes there, I think, is a really good one, because you don't have to be in academia or anything like that to really value the life of the mind and to really to love it and to devote yourself to it. We're seeing a lot of alternatives to this. The Peterson Academy,
Right.
for example, doesn't give you a recognizable certificate at the end of whatever you're doing there, but it allows you to get a lot of education. And the reason why that's available is people are demanding it. There are all kinds of things that are out there where people are turning away from sort of the traditional academic approach and just reading and studying on their own. There's plenty of good stuff that's available for that. Yeah. And I think De Sapio here would agree that this is a really helpful development, and that there's, you don't have to end up in, sort of the academic echo chambers in order to really pursue an active intellectual life. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Right. Well, thanks, Glenn. Thanks for the topic, and thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We really appreciate the fact that you made it all the way to the end, and now you get the reward of hearing us talk about Patreon. So if you would, check out our Patreon page. We could use the help financially to support the show. We don't take any funds from the money that's donated through Patreon to the show. That all goes entirely to the production of the show and to its promotion. So if you are a giver, if you give to us through Patreon, we thank you for that. And if you have been helped by this podcast, we encourage you to check it out and give if you can. Of course, there's always the like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. Isn't it nice that we wait to the very end to make the appeal? I don't know if people have noticed that most other folks, you can't even get to the content before you get like 10 minutes of like arm twisting to get you to do stuff. We don't do that. We just trust you to help us out. Anyway, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.